We actually share an office. Yeah, he's got my office. He is full now. We just got, yeah, we have a grace period here with folks. Where you over there? Yeah. Let's start. Thank you all for being here. I realize it's been rather dense, but I'm sure that what we have reserved for you will not relax you perhaps, but, but will be extremely nourishing for you. So it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Regina Bendix, whom I met in the context of work that I did with a group of people on intangible heritage. Regina has an incredibly diverse list of research interests. As I am a generalist, I have to take my hats off because Regina is a true generalist. I just want to read some of the subjects and of course, each time she works on something, she publishes a very thick book, which is available.
That's not true.
She's very modest. This is one of her strengths and weaknesses. She publishes an enormous book, which is available on their website and is always open access and also published. So it's a real challenge to talk about all of the things that she's been working on. She did her thesis in Switzerland, on which little village?
Interlaken and Altdorf, the William Tell place.
Yes, the place that reenact the William Tell myth. She continued working in the area of heritage and cultural property. She directed research on the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. For reasons I cannot reconstruct all of the pathways, but then she has worked intensively on expertise and the role of expertise, including anthropological expertise in creating discursive frameworks, but also interstices for anthropological inflection. She's worked on crafts. She's based in Germany, so she's worked on a variety of German crafts, including bread making. And I think you were indirectly related to work on organ preservation and heritage.
But that is all doctoral people.
Yeah, that's all right. That's really part of what we do. She's worked recently on collecting narratives about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As you see, this goes quite far around the 1967 Six-Day War. And then recently she contacted me to see if I was interested in working with her on a panel on diffusing bombs, which went beyond even what I can imagine in my rather broad and eclectic craft. Yes, I'm sure it is. It's a dangerous craft. Yes.
Yeah.
Regina is a great practitioner of interdisciplinarity. She's worked with economists, and let's just stop and take that in.
With nice economists.
With nice economists, yes, institutional economists. She's worked with lawyers. We can stop also and pause on that one. And I think you're currently working on issues of agricultural policy in relation to the German Ministry of Agriculture and some of the ways in which they're trying to promote organic farming. So it's really, I think it's really admirable. She doesn't receive compliments very well, but you will receive the compliment for her. It's really admirable. And this is an entirely different research that she's going to present, so I won't say more about it, except that I thank you so much for being here. It's a great pleasure, and the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Je ne vais pas présenter en français, mais je veux dire que c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I have all these projects because when I moved to Germany, I learned that a professor is a grant writing machine for other people. So there are just a lot of different topics, and this one here that I'm presenting on would have probably fit yesterday after that museum panel, because ultimately it deals with provenance research and restitution. With regard to the title, it requires a little bit of expansion. It's not just the living and the dead, but it's also otherworldly entities, if you want. I will report on an ongoing project on human remains collections. It is an ethnographic situation requiring prismatic representation. With vignettes, I seek to make transparent the systematically inherent heterogeneity of actors and the contradictions that are part of post-colonial interactions in this realm in particular. In lieu of an overarching analytic position, I offer punctual readings of moments observed and or participated in. There are a number of concepts, though, that were helpful in working through this material for the first time. I work with the term conjuncture to draw attention to the shifting figurations informing positionality and giving space to agency. I observe atmospheres shaped by ways of speaking, reacting, and interacting in the presence of or under the impression of human remains. And I sing the praises of innovation and intervention. So let's enter the field. In June 1888, a scholar wrote in his diary, "It is most unpleasant work to steal bones from a grave, but what is the use? Someone has to do it." One of his biographers asserts, quote, "The grave robbing haunted him," and quotes again from his diary, "I dreamed of skulls and bones all last night. I dislike very much working with this stuff, i.e. collecting it, not having it." If the scholar was haunted, not least because of his awareness that he committed theft and paid others to steal, he was also committed to the idea of a physical component in the unfolding anthropological enterprise. Human remains were part in this emerging four-field discipline, with crania in particular considered a viable means of establishing difference. Notable actors in museums and universities alike were at the time in frantic competition to enhance their collection as foundations for addressing, at least on the surface, new research questions. In Bénédicte Savoy's assessment, this accumulation of objects was deeply intertwined with both knowledge production and fantasies of ruling the world. With regard to human remains, this is evident already in testimony from the late 18th century, such as Georges Cuvier's encouragement, cited by, what's her name, Cressida Forde, to travelers to collect skeletons, or at least parts of skeletons of foreign races. In offering human remains to museums and university collections, the young scholar cited thus did not just hope to make money, but also to garner recognition, potentially leading to employment. Franz Boas is easily recognizable from this opening. This is the Northwest Coast. But one best regards him as a figure in this sense of Norbert Elias's processual analysis. One could look also at William Ramsay Smith, who did not receive any remuneration for his supplying Edinburgh University with remains, but who benefited in a variety of other ways, receiving published literature, introductions to learned societies, and access to leading scholars in a highly prestigious scientific field. Ramsay, like Franz Boas, was one among many protagonists, one figure acting within a scientific and socio-political conjuncture that toyed with rendering the anatomical and anthropometric interest in comparing human crania into one that used cranial difference for race science. While Ramsey worked for race science, Boas would use his own measuring and his fieldwork to oppose it. When we confront today the chillingly huge collections of human remains in venerable research collections, it is worthwhile to look at them as a result of conjunctures, a term useful for grasping the complexity of historical moments and the connections between individual elements within them. There were individuals whose desires surpassed others and who used resources and positions to amass ever more materials, as it is called. Their desires were fueled not just by the drive to have the most scientifically significant collection, but also by the then state of science, the emplacement of financial support of science in society, national politics, the politics of colonialism and self-understood hegemonies ruling it. The latter led to a contemptuous disregard for occasional indigenous protest against grave desecration, for which there is ample evidence. 6 to 8 decades later, the conjuncture was different. The vast majority of the thousands of crania from Edinburgh to Cambridge, Paris to Berlin, and Moscow to Melbourne rested in storage vaults, and still do. The theories that gave rise to their collection were for the most part discredited. Their use in teaching was from the outset limited. The disciplines that had originated with such collections had developed new questions, new methods, and new tools. Probably about 90% of the human remains in collections were never used or useful after their journey from grave to collection. In the late 19th and early 20th century, human crania and other skeletal components were displayed in museums at world fairs. They were photographed and published and deeply part of societal conversation. Later in the 20th century, however, the metropolitan public had generally no knowledge of human remains collections. They had long dropped out of mass media coverage. While some local populations worked intensively to recover ancestral remains, the silence in public discourse stemmed from a loss in scientific relevance and mirrored the eerie neglect, in some cases heightened by war damage of human remains in many collection settings. Now, in the 21st century, collections of crania are emplaced in a new conjuncture. Decolonial activism, post-colonial theories, and research in colonial history, though differently motivated depending on location and historical experience, contribute to passionate self-examination in societies acknowledging their former colonial exploits and the lasting economic power stemming from that phase. Among many other facets, the post-colonial dynamic thrusts human remains collections into the limelight. Comedian John Oliver devoted a large segment of his show in early October of this year to them, blurting out sentences such as, quote, "A head in a box is less something you expect to find in an academic institution than in the basement of a fucking serial killer." Indigenous actors in charge of repatriation efforts have outlined for decades the clear breach of customary and legally supported peaceful rest of the dead, of intellectual savagery, and the duty to care. Enacted in 1990, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA for short, in the USA, is the result of Native activism and has contributed to making skull collections visible, and the result of strong and relentless Native activism, as is generally the case in putting colonial collections on the global agenda. In 21st century anthropology and ethnology, we find, in addition to post-colonial work, the intermingling of silences and trauma, meeting up what in the most recent issue of Annual Reviews in Anthropology is termed the emergence of an anthropological hauntology, themes that are also deeply part of emerging work with remains. The project Sensitive Provenances at Göttingen University addresses human remains from colonial contexts in two collections: the Blumenbach collection affiliated with the Center for Anatomy, and the collection in the Biological Anthropology Department. Framing the following glimpses into this project with the term conjuncture is helpful on the general and the immediate level. Generally, and in the midst for cause of decolonizing disciplines, it remains relevant to grasp the historical figurations that brought about collection frenzy, silence, and now discomfort regarding such collections. What happened in between and what happens in the present diverges in multifaceted ways, and the actors I'm about to acquaint you with are as were Boas and his contemporaries also figures, seeking to alter, undo, find a way forward, finding themselves moving in a contemporary conjuncture where, as Rolf Lindner uses the term, circumstances of structural, cultural, and biographical nature meet up. The benefits and costs evident in the present are perhaps as questionable in a future hindsight as was the past compilation of these collections from today's perspective. Göttingen University houses approximately 1,800 skulls, which is a small number when one looks at skull collections, of which about 1,400 are of non-European provenance. Our grant responded to a funding line from the VW Foundation addressing colonial collections. It brings together scholars and scientists from history, anatomy, and biological anthropology, including custodians, to devise ways of addressing human remains from colonial provenance, drawing on the interdisciplinary complementarity. In that regard, it continues efforts that have actually already generated detailed guidelines for human restitution. VW's parameters stipulated further that a scholar from a potential area of origin be included in the team. The chosen individual is the Fijian anthropologist, Dr. T. I have them all with first names, even though I know you can just look them up. It's hard. Working in museology. The evaluators of the application further decided that we should receive more money to bring fellows from countries of potential origin for stays of 2 to 3 months to participate in the work. The cultural anthropologists in this project, the postdoc JK and myself, are tasked with a meta-study of the cooperation between the other participants. In terms of this conference's give and take, our observations, our ethnographic ways of reading scholarship from these disciplines, and our interventions in the team are what we are able to give with the intent to raise self-awareness among disciplinary actors regarding their self-understood habits of work and canons of knowledge. We are also involved in the work of establishing contact with actors in the areas where Germany had colonies. The project is now in its final year. I draw for this paper on field notes kept since the time of the grant application, on single and group interviews, work with the growing literature on provenance research, and recorded Zoom conversations with contacts in the Pacific area. And so we start. Next to our project, another provenance endeavor takes place in museums of Lower Saxony. A former PhD student reported the following episode from a small museum in City A. There, a careful search in the museum's attic turned up a skull. While the find was reported to Australia based on the archival evidence, the museum's curator could not get herself to simply put the skull back in the attic until such a time as its restitution might be decided. She placed it in a basket, covered it with a soft piece of cloth, and kept it in her office. The unorthodox handling shows a respectful tenderness, a non-custodial treatment of a deceased individual that had been classified and forgotten as an object. The transformation back to personhood acknowledges death, which in turn demands gestures and acts of cross-cultural decency and humility, for which a new repertoire has to be invented. Knowing of human remains is an abstract matter, but encountering unburied crania generates deeper reactions, not least because it is an encounter with death, which but few people will scale down to an encounter with mere bones. What made skulls so central to early anatomists seeking to delineate human races is also what makes them uncanny. Unlike a femur or a clavicula, they outline the features features central to intersubjective encounters. KS, the anatomy doctoral student in our team, handles skull with a gentleness bordering on the sensual. Without gloves, but with utmost respect, she feels for signs of age and possible illness, equipped with a professional expertise that also permits her to accept the nature of the collection within which she works. For the team members from history and anthropology, cultural anthropology, confronting the serialized nature of the collections and finding themselves in position to lift each skull out of its carton, to check its number against the archival evidence for it, provoked reactions ranging from initial nausea to routinization, ruptured by the awareness of the violence done to any given skull, though generally after death they are all separated from the rest of the skeleton, and the need to relate intersubjectively, which the anatomist, though from a different disciplinary motivation and ethos, also shares. The next scene. The Skull Project was initiated by the then chief of Göttingen Central Collection Office. When asked why she decided to tackle this collection among the plentiful academic collections with colonial tentacles, she answered, to see what would happen. She rightly surmised that an interdisciplinary collaboration on this topic would create productive disquiet. The work began with the corona pandemic, and the planned regular meetings of all parties were sparse and online. Nonetheless, it was possible to document concerns in part conflicting disciplinary perspectives from the outset, arising from habitual research practice. It was clear, for instance, that the retired custodian of the Blumenbach collection, Professor S., remained the person in control of access to both the remains and the extant knowledge and indices going with it, and his nominal successor, Professor V, deferred to the latter's expertise. Our project adds adjectives such as ambiguous or dark to scientific heritage, and Blumenbach is huge scientific heritage. Our project designations that the Blumenbach collection holds in anatomical circles. Recognizing the threat of its valence, Professor Edge hedged for months with providing the holding list to team members, yet the list was essential for assessing how many remains from where the collection actually contains. Our project planned to emphasize remains from Africa and Oceania, and the list was needed to know which countries and or institutions to take up contact with. Professor V and the doctoral student KS eventually made the list available with the request not to circulate beyond selected team members for fear that the list might contain errors. The typical secrecy that one finds in many collection subcultures is heightened by the post-colonial beleaguerment experienced by custodians and researchers alike. A student group in Göttingen toppled the statue of Blumenbach, which in turn led Professor S to hide the 5 skulls central to the Blumenbach taxonomy, which thus far have been exhibited in Göttingen's Anatomy Center. And now nobody knows where they are. They are hidden in thousands of boxes. The physical anthropologists affiliated with the project, by contrast, responded openly to queries from the national press. They practice DNA-based research in non-colonial projects. They seek non-invasive natural science methods to search for provenance and carry information about the developments in their discipline into the project. A first takeaway from the ethnography of interdisciplinary natural science attitudes toward collections differ, not just due to personalities, but also due to the collection's place in the respective field. For project team members in history, as well as cultural anthropology, collection holding lists form part of the public record and ought to be made accessible. To keep the interdisciplinary configuration open, however, the wishes of Professor S were respected, But with every new visitor from a society of origin entering our configuration, the visibility of the list increases until hopefully such a list as will be globally shared as a resource for actors in the provenance and restitution field. Now we switch to laughter. Our team member, Dr. T, teaches at the University of Hawaii and is herself from Fiji. She organized Zoom conversations with states in Oceania from whence there are remains in the Göttingen collections. Together with the two postdocs in history and cultural anthropology, the project was presented to each of these interlocutors with a PowerPoint, followed by questions and open conversation. In June 2021, a Zoom conversation with representatives from the tiny island of Nauru took place. Nauru became a German colony in 1888, and when its phosphate deposits were discovered, Germany participated heavily in mining them. After British, Australian, and Japanese control, Nauru gained independence in 1968. Once graced with the highest per capita income, Nauru was left in abject poverty with the ecological catastrophe brought on by the mining. Nauru's Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Director of the National Heritage, and Nauru's Museum, the Director of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the contracted individual from Australia participated in the Zoom meeting, listening with some surprise to the information presented. In Del Heim's framework of an ethnography is speaking, Dr. T used throughout the key of oceanic siblinghood, honoring the interlocutors repeatedly and presenting our project as an opportunity to build relationships. Our two postdocs, with the seriousness of academic consultation, the Nauruans spoke cheerfully, often with a slight giggle in the voice. Initially, they were mostly interested whether the bones in Göttingen might assist their questions regarding the settlement of Nauru, or more pressing, whether DNA research might clarify present-day proclivity to obesity and diabetes. Finally, they asked, what were these bones used for? They and our team members, JK and HS, expressed in highly serious tones the racist underpinnings in the remains collection endeavor. Early in the Zoom meeting, the interlocutors indicated with twinkles that some people in Nauru had interest in German relations, hinting at mixed parentage from colonial times. Toward the end, they expressed their hope to learn more about the bones in Göttingen and, with very loud giggles, promised to communicate information about some German bones that we might have in Nauru. The German team is generally carried by the seriousness of the undertaking. Discovering colonial history is, in the broader society, developing in what in Germany is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, in this case, a past preceding National Socialism. Likewise, unpacking the material evidence of race science's pervasiveness is a weighty matter. Dr. T, however, as the Pacific Island scholar in the team, carries an air of opportunity and new beginnings into the project. She frames all her exchanges, be they over email, Zoom, or face-to-face, with a sense of welcoming the challenge. To her, the human remains constitute a bridge between Pacific Island societies, their museum specialists, their students. Good things come from this is a phrase she says often, and in her experience, they do. She tells the story of how her conference presentation at a regional meeting in the Solomon Islands moved the translator so much that after her talk, quote, he comes out of the booth straight away and he shakes my hand and says, I really enjoyed your presentation. And he told me, you know, you moved me. I actually have a feather mani from the Solomons in my home in New Caledonia, and I believe the feather mani should not stay there. It should come back to the Solomon Islands, end quote. Dr. T facilitated the museum connection, and she beams. We paid for him to fly from New Caledonia with a feather mani, and they had a big ceremony in Honiara that was so beautiful. It is not easy for this kind of optimism to penetrate the serious shell within which provenance and repatriation scholarship and practice have taken shape in Central Europe. Here, the rigor is necessary to convince funders and support for new institutions devoted specifically to this cause. But it is the actors joining us from elsewhere who are inch by inch inserting an alternative gaze and mood. Encountering Dr. T and watching the Zoom conferences with the Pacific Islanders offers a further crucial takeaway. Restitution requests and provenance research open up spaces with quite distinct atmospheres. They are shaped not least by ways of speaking, gestures, and being in the world, alongside the historical and life experience individuals carry into the arena. For the future of provenance research, sensing these atmospheres also holds the promise to accept the different future-oriented opportunities they present. Permitting those spaces to resonate requires self-examination also among those actors who have been strong movers in researching collections' colonial histories, and a second look at disciplinary self-examination. The historians entered the project with the confidence born from the status of history held by that discipline. I don't know how it is here, but history in the humanities is us as well. So they have a very strong sense of self-importance. Also in this case, from their new and pioneering engagement with colonial history and their prior provenance research. Professor H and Dr. H.S. also built on experience in working with colleagues from societies of origin. In an email before the project even started, when we were looking for who to hire, they communicated their joint assessments such as, quote, "Working with non-European colleagues is occasionally complicated. And without wanting to invoke colonial stereotypes, we have to take a safe course and work, for instance, closely with colleagues such as CR, who is an international, well-connected in human remains work." End quote. "We are also insecure in this field," Professor H told me later, "which is unsettling for historians who habitually know which way to proceed. But reading the mail as an ethnographer, it seemed to assert the correctness of the German path of provenance research, and participants from former colonial regions should be selected so that they would have both scholarly and institutional familiarity with the ways of internationally established provenance research. This attitude manifested itself also when first restitution requests arrived. While others in the team felt obliged to respond to the terms proposed, the historian held that our response should take into consideration first the work rhythm of colleagues at other German institutions involved, and not give in to the pressure of a delegation imposing a date. HS argued from his knowledge of how time-consuming the historical production of restitution case files would be, while others questioned whether institutions holding the skulls were entitled to impose their calendar on an unfolding restitution. The anatomist, as part of the medical school, brought qua natural science expertise also the air of assured disciplinarity. The Blumenbach collection, however, represents an increasingly exposed Achilles heel, not just due to the mismatch between sheer size and limited scientific value, but also the limited possibilities of shedding scientific light on provenance. Activists' accusations regarding the racist components of early anatomy circulate broadly, though within critical science research this has of course long received critical attention. What is more problematic in scientific terms is the lingering presence of conflating biological diversity of select phenotypic characteristics with socio-historical factors. This linkage remains extant in, for instance, nomenclatures that suggest cultural identities such as Mongolian or Ethiopian. These historical nomenclatures are nonetheless present in the vocabulary of anatomists of today. So that my postdoc has invented the term calcified identities that are sitting there in scientific discourse, where actually DNA profiles rather suggest great diversity within rather than between populations. In our meetings, this kind of cultural or ethnic denominators were inserted with great ease into team exchanges with that confidential or confidence-ridden habitus of an anatomist or also a biological anthropologist, until we began to insert critical assessments of these kinds of nomenclatures. There is a palpable loss in scientific self-assurance in the interdisciplinary space. There is acknowledgement that provenance and restitution are part of the present socio-political and academic conjuncture, though it is clear that this will also lead to more and more gaps in what was held to be a complete collection. In the growing interest for fellows from societies of origin, the ethnographers refrain from directly pointing out the awkward and stereotypical behaviors, such as displaying an anatomist's eagerness to be a spectator in a non-Western ceremony, or betraying his colonialist mental residue when asking a Pacific visitor, "Do you spend a lot of time on boats?" And the irritation among the rest of the team is then counterbalanced by at least the physical anthropologist, Professor S.H., who with great politeness and acknowledgement of his alternate expertise offered a tour to the anthropological collection to THH, the head of repatriation from Auckland's De Papa Museum, and also at the moment in Göttingen as a project fellow. A further perspective and different atmosphere unfolds now in when we have the presence from our visitors, fellows from African countries. AS joined our project as a fellow, a young historian from Tanzania. She repeatedly wonders, what right do I have to be involved in these remains, especially if they are not from my area? To many citizens of her country, these bones are not good. They have magic in them, she says, because they are not where they are supposed to be, and as they have been kept in limbo, they do not exude positive power. Likewise, she surmises that the scientists who brought and kept the remains would be regarded as something like sorcerers, ambiguous or bad in their motivations. She connects this assessment of sentiments in her native country with what she observes in Germany, with the various quite fierce initiatives to return human remains to where they were taken. It appears as if the ills of colonialism, encoded in countless exhumed skulls, also constitutes bad magic for a European university. Quote, just because they want to give it back now, AS argues, does not mean that someone has to take it. Such divestment is hampered in countless other ways, not least because return recipients prove in many cases elusive. Several visitors from societies of origin were deeply disappointed to realize that it would be close to impossible to identify descendants and arrange return to family. AS has been participating in a joint German African research project in which she writes her dissertation on colonial artifacts and summarizes her impression, quote, the skulls and also the way artifacts are treated in provenance research is in a way attacking them with the same scholarly rigor as what has brought them into collection in the first place. These kinds of, that's the scientific rigor. Metaphorically, she sees it akin to attacking the enslaved with the scholarly approach, quote, reinforcing the structure of subjugation. One path to take, she felt, would be to disrupt the research methodologies of archives, museums, and disciplines to explore trauma and colonial violence, and thus separate the remains from the very ways in which they were captured and systematized in the first place. Yeah. Like AS, MA spent a few months with our project as a fellow. He is working on a history PhD from the perspective of a history of collections in reverse. Discerning in his knowledge of African historical sources, oral and otherwise, he speaks extensively about his distrust of archival documents encountered in Germany. For skulls, perhaps even more so than artifacts. Quote, the archivalia give more information about who got what from whom within Germany, he says. For skulls, perhaps even more so than artifacts. A collector or a merchant may have gotten the skull from one place, but only noted it in his diary a few days or even a few villages later. The likely imprecision adds to what he regards as an already phenomenal difficulty in repatriation in his country. He is visibly distressed at one such description he has found, which read, quote, skulls were found at the side of the road and no one seemed to care for them, so they were taken, unquote. He easily surmises that the innocuous note disguised an illicit arrangement and payment. When MA steps out of his role as historian and speaks of the human remains as a citizen of his country, he turns ashen. It is just terrible. If people knew, the remains should be under the ground today. It pains him to realize that it is not likely to happen anytime soon. His country is at present more interested in artifacts than human remains. The space of provenance and repatriation shaped in these conversations is atmospherically full of ambiguity and somber concern. There is the demographic complexity in some African states where returning to a society of origin is obscured by migration, civil wars, chiefdoms split due to new borders drawn during colonial and post-colonial reigns, make it difficult to decide even which interlocutors might be contacted. AS senses that some kind of spiritual work is needed, whatever that might be. Her sense of affective agency emanating from these skulls is in their square boxes is something I share. AS plans to find means to communicate broadly the materiality and history of these collections in Tanzania. Remains in limbo, she has decided, should not be an issue only for the small group affected, but for civil society, particularly in a state so riddled with former chiefdoms, uneasily cohering in the polity. With their differentiated appraisals, fellows arriving in Göttingen gave a lot, but most of all, the sense that human remains collections mobilize agency for the present and future. Unpacking the collection certainly opens perspectives into colonial history, shifting Eurocentric fixation toward witnessing global interconnectedness. But it is the careful consideration of what will these remains do in my society that AS, MA, and others carried into the project. Outside of the world of science and outside of European activist groups engaged in debating their own society's embroilment in colonizations, human remains collections are seen as lives that ended and were prevented from decay and or transformation into ancestors in the terrain they had inhabited. Their existence calls for ritual action. I'm afraid I'm not getting done in 45 minutes. On February 9th, 2022, representatives delegated by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs came to Göttingen to ceremoniously receive Ibi Kupuna, ancestors held in Göttingen's human remains collections. By the time the delegation arrived, our team had been amply rattled by exchanges with EHA, a lawyer and activist working in restitution for the past 33 years. Göttingen was the second of 5 collections from whence OHA, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, was reclaiming human remains in the course of a 10-day trip, each visit punctuated with a ceremony. We met with representatives from the other collections to be visited, scouted the internet for visuals of Hawaiian restitutions held elsewhere, and received further details during a stern Zoom conference ordered by OHA. Given the manner of the communication, we were concerned about getting something wrong in this delicate intercultural encounter, and yet the ceremony in Göttingen, like everywhere else, was improvised. From a performance perspective, every instance of ritual is singular, built on the competence of what makes it whole and effective. In the case of repatriation, not only the claimants had to craft the ceremonial ensemble doing justice to the task of greeting and ultimately taking home human remains. On our side, too, multiple elements were improvised to somehow do justice to what was an intimate and funerary, an official, an intercultural, a post-colonial, and ultimately a new kind of event. The delegation had demanded 2 rooms without daylight, one where the iwi kupuna would rest and where they would perform the first part of the ceremony on their own. From prior experience, they requested tools in order to remove nails and wire with which skeletal parts in collections are often connected. We had been asked not to expose the remains to daylight, to examine, and to move their location from the moment the repatriation request was made. The collection officers, however, could not endure the thought of letting the delegation see the old cartons, and new ones were made with new labels in identical script. In accordance with our own funerary sensibilities, we added flowers, and to greet in the Hawaiian spirit, had asked a flower store to make lace, which did not really look like lace. And 2 of us also made necklaces out of Burberries to add a wreath tradition from parts of Germany. The ceremony which unfolded was aired live in Hawaii with a processional and chanting, bringing the repackaged remains into a room where we waited, followed by speech making from the university side and our team, from the American consul, and from the guests speaking about their work, their connections to these tasks, their background. They concluded the event by sprinkling salty water on all of us so that we would be free of the bad energy surrounding the iwi kupuna, and the water was in wooden bowls, as you can see. The stern request to have wooden bowls available with water in which Hawaiian salt would be dissolved had caused considerable concern, as the demand had been presented with such vigor and no one owned such a bowl, and I now do. When we had a small ancestor greeting ceremony with the Maori THH half a year later, I thus had a mild shock when I saw that the assistant in the anthropology collection had put a glass bowl into the room and it had no water in it. THH laughed when I told him over coffee and said, quote, "And you all did not know that you were supposed to give me the bowl, but it doesn't matter." He kept laughing rather merrily, sketching the ways in which some actors seek to control these emerging rituals and those who find themselves as the clumsy hosts. At one of the first ceremonies THH participated in Great Britain, the British host asked the leader of the Maori delegation what was to be done with the bowl after the ceremony. THH remembers, quote, "I thought that, well, of course, could now just be put back into regular circulation. It had done its ceremonial duty. But the leader of the delegation sternly said, 'You must bury it.'" Again, he shook with laughter and then said, "Some people get into this power role and make up rules where there have not been any," which is understandable. Provenance research and claims for restitution are consequential interventions. Given the many actors who intersect, the differential contexts and experiences they bring to the task, innovations are what is generated within this new configuration, where restitution claimants such as EHH and THH emerge as figures, much as were the skull providers 150 years earlier. Provenance research, in turn, is a scholarly innovation in reaction to decolonial activism. Likewise, the administrative practice of formulating letters reclaiming human remains funneled through the right channels. The benefit of ritual in this new conjuncture is its offer of the aesthetic and gravity appropriate for dealing with death. Atmospherically, it disturbs the routine of research procedure and legal accoutrements that keep crowding into this halting process. It is a gift from societies of origin, helping former colonists to get out of their shame with some dignity. Reflecting on the number of prominent exhumation and reburials in the aftermath of 1989, Catherine Verderi published The Political Lives of Dead Bodies. A benefit of the current century's attention to human remains in scientific collections is indeed their politicization. If at the time of their removal from burial sites they re-entered, in Arjuna Padurai's terms, social life as things, as objects in the crosshairs of science and commerce, human remains clamor in the present for acknowledgement of their status as historical and spiritual subjects. While their individuality can, in the majority of cases, no longer be re-established, there is hopefully an end in sight to their status in limbo. Though a great deal of imagination is still needed to give contours to what kind of reinterment is suitable and where it is to be. In her account, Verderi also analyzes the anonymous dead, and her observations can be applied to the socio-political agency of human remains, unquote. Through them, not individual or national biographies, but entire social categories are repositioned or associated with different sets of values. Dead body politics of this sort have the important effect of inserting such reevaluation directly into the lives of persons, families. Political consequences of such events depend on variations in the numbers and kinds of nameless dead and the causes of their death, unquote. Verderi too uses vocabulary pointing to ghosts and haunting. The shock in encountering human remains, in re-evaluating collection vaults filled with cube-shaped cardboard boxes within each of which rests just one skull severed from its body, is part of the cost that goes along with the benefits of the renewed visibility of unburied, non-consenting, and forgotten research subjects, as well as the visibility and presence of those reclaiming them. More so than so-called ethnographica, human remains evoke from all parties concerned a visceral reaction, ranging from emotional and spiritual concerns to political reassessments. The space created in repatriation is cognizant of the past. It offers parameters within which to acknowledge vast experiential differences. It offers also a grand portal to revisit and enlarge the question of time in the construction of the other. In terms of anthropological theorizing, and still more so in terms of inhabiting a planet where we are all others and neighbors at once, this is one of its benefits. In his time and the other, Johannes Fabian demonstrated that ethnographers, in working with the figment of the ethnographic present, had denied coevalness to those whom they studied, thus denying the very circumstance that permitted and shaped the intersubjective encounter on which ethnographic knowledge production rested. In confronting the remnants of the dead in storage closets, we do not control authorship, as did the classic ethnographers, but rather are part of the globally unfolding script of how to proceed with redressing the fate of deceased individuals, once so much not coeval that they were disturbed in their graves, so coeval now that they generate new kinds of politics, interactions, and sensibilities. What does a collection look like when it is empty? A.S. uttered this question in her brainstorming about what ought to be to or might happen with global human remains collections. I find it helpful to put Danish anthropologist Martin Spritzrup's question next to it. If the act of repatriation represents a solution, what then is the problem this solution is envisaged to address? Activists have answered Spritzrup's question. Colonial history, particularly as experienced in colonies, were not discussed in Western societies, especially not in Germany. Human remains collections were invisible. The scholars and societies in our small project, scholars and scientists in our small project have the chance to combine research and what Sylvie Chakalakal in her reinterpretation of Elias's figuration terms, creative agency, to contribute to these global redressings and to support the enlarging of the arena where recognition of alternate historical experience and ways of knowing are granted power. As long as it is not considered a closure, restitution, particularly or perhaps only of human remains, is one small lever with which intercultural encounter for the present and future can be tried out. In the presence of human remains and the atmospheric shift they provoke, such meetings appear to be a good start, enforcing a view beyond restitution, fully aware that unpacking old sufferings may generate new ones. Thank you.
For delivering all of these atmospheres and enriching the give and take paradigm so wonderfully. I think we have a couple of minutes if someone wants to make a comment or a question.
Otherwise, we could drink beer now.
You get a free one. Any remarks? Yes.
Just thank you. This was wonderful. A thought that came to me was how. Oh my God! Yeah, it's been a long day. Maybe it's a thought, maybe it's a brain fart. Who knows? To what extent are these remains dead if they generate so much, activity, protest? Are there any kind of, material takes on these processes?
The material, well, I regard the take that they're filled with magic as a note in that direction, or the THH, the Maori. He argues that ancestors are bones, so that he constructs his lineage, and he just says it's idiotic that Europeans think 150 years is the cutoff point where it's relevant, but because he counts back thousands of years as ancestors inhabiting and forming an active link. So sure, you could throw a new materialism at it also.
Fiona?
Thank you very much. It was really a beautiful presentation. It triggered some questions in me. One also, and that's more a superficial perception because I never was involved directly with discussions about human remains. Looking at the public discourse, I sometimes have the impression that diasporic communities relate differently to these questions than communities, let's say, in the source regions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you also experience something like that, and how do you handle these multiple stakeholder situations?
Not sufficiently. We have the situation of Maori and Moriori, where it gets really interesting because some of the Moriori skulls were taken by Maori in an earlier warring confrontation, and now the Maori are coming to help the Moriori getting their skulls back. They're also they're getting somebody from Samoa to come in the summer who is interested in some of the but it doesn't address the migration part. I think I'll not. It's too complicated to explain. But because we're focusing on these particular areas at the moment, we would have other ones too. It's terrible. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A last remark or comment? Yes.
Just one question. Working in this interdisciplinary team and then coming with an outside look as the anthropologists also looking at the historians, for example, how would they perceive your observations?
How they perceive us?
No, your observations, not you as anthropologists, but
Well, I sent this talk very gingerly to the historian. One of the historians, not yet the postdoc, only the colleague, and she immediately started to, but who very well, the physical anthropologists reacted very well because the postdoc that I work with wrote a couple quite fierce papers about the nomenclature that they use and had long comment. They're even co-authoring now a paper, so they are very open to it, but I don't think I can share this with the anatomist. I'm hoping he retires soon.
Thank you again, and yes, that was a wonderful way to close a
Thank you.
very long day now, dinner, beer, wine, and there's also the concert afterwards, so thank you all.